All right. The first thing I want to say is that we want to establish the context within which all of our research takes place. And yes, my three colleagues are MPhil students, but we're all, in this particular panel, we're all members of the CEDU. We represent the CEDU. And our research really reflects the philosophy of, one of the core philosophies of the CEDU, to do research on issues that we think are important to economic development in Caribbean countries specifically, but also issues relevant to small island developing states. So all of our research is going to really be in that sort of thematic area. Just a brief overview of what I'll present this evening. The context, the regional vulnerability to hazards and disasters, and I use the terms deliberately, hazards as opposed to disasters. The role of MFIs, or microfinance institutions, in economic development and disaster risk management, including some case studies from the Caribbean, and then present some conclusions and recommendations. As I said, the context of the research really is in line with what we do at CEDU, focusing on sustainable development, but recognizing that sustainable development requires attention be paid to social, economic, and environmental vulnerability. Earlier this morning, several of the presenters alluded to the fact that policy formulation and implementation, particularly in the Caribbean context, needs to take cognizance of the region's vulnerability to natural hazards and disasters. So it is really in a similar vein that this research was conducted, that if we are to talk about sustainable development in our region, we tend to focus pretty much on the economic issues, but there are also social and environmental dimensions that have to be taken on board. This piece of research, the particular research that I'm presenting, focuses on all three dimensions. The clientele of microfinance institutions are primarily poor persons, people who might be living close to or below the poverty line. In terms of social access, they lack basic education, they tend to lack access to healthcare facilities, etc. And they are sometimes living in environmentally, and I put in there in parentheses, in environmentally or socially vulnerable or volatile areas. Coming on the heels of some of the research I did in Jamaica was actually done in the area where the now famous, infamous Dudus, his territory. So I had to actually go in there. And I remember calling the office one day while I was there and telling them it was the first time in my life traveling to Jamaica that I didn't breathe for about an hour. The other point in terms of the context of the research is that microfinance institutions buffer what may at times be a downward spiral for persons who are poor, and therefore microfinance institutions therefore have a pivotal role to play in poverty alleviation, which for all intents and purposes is one of the main targets of economic development. Again, just to put some context to the presentation, this pie chart points to natural disasters that have occurred and the share of disaster experiences that different countries in the Caribbean, and I'm using here the larger definition of the Caribbean to include the non-English speaking Caribbean. So if you look at the pie chart, you will see that Haiti, for example, has experienced 29% of the number of the disasters that have affected the region between 1990 and 2008, and in fact I should say of the hazards. 165 hazards have affected the region between 1990 and 2008, and Haiti, I think post-January the 12th, I think we all got a greater sense of Haiti's vulnerability to natural hazards, so it's not difficult for us to imagine these statistics. And then the Dominican Republic follows with a close 20, and then you have countries like Jamaica. Jamaica having experienced 13% of the 165 or so hazards that have affected the region. And as I think Dr. Leon pointed out this morning, one of the things that makes Jamaica's situation, as in the case of Haiti, particularly acute and particularly worrisome, is that separate and apart from the economic vulnerability and the economic shocks, exogenous shocks that these countries have faced, you put on top of that the threat of natural hazards. Jamaica's experience last week, for example, the first headline that hit the newspapers was that the government now needs to review the budget because the budget has been shot because of the impact of Hurricane Nicole. And Hurricane Nicole, Tropical Storm Nicole, did not even really hit Jamaica. It was really the outer bands that affected Jamaica and caused significant amount of disruption to education, to bridges, to infrastructure. So government now has to find funds to reallocate towards that rehabilitation process in Jamaica. Another bar graph there, which we're not going to spend a lot of time on, that shows the number of disasters by country. In terms of what all of these bar graphs and pie charts mean in terms of numbers, it suggests that some work that we did recently back in 2009, looking at the impact of disasters, we estimated that between 1990 and 2008, the economic impact of disasters was about $63 billion US. The total damage to the region we estimated at $136 billion, and the source of our information was the damage assessment reports done by the UN ECLAC, and we then used those figures together with some other methodological components and came up with these numbers. The social cost in terms of damage to schools, houses, etc., $57 billion, infrastructural damage, $12 billion, environmental damage, $3.5 billion, and we add a caveat to these numbers because while the ECLAC has been pretty diligent in doing the assessment reports, we know that because of a lack of baseline data in the region, we sometimes do not have a sufficient basis on which to determine what damage was ex post as opposed to ex ante. So certainly in terms of things like the environmental damage, we were a little cautious and we felt that those figures might be underrepresented. But this is just to give you a snapshot of what the loss, the damage that has been happening in the region from disasters. In terms of the literature, disaster risk reduction and poverty alleviation, the literature suggests, and certainly in some of the field research that I've done over the last year and a half or so, reducing disaster risk is an integral part of the fight against poverty because, as we will come to see, and my apologies for that typographical error which I've just seen, the empirical data suggests that really the poor suffer the most in times of a disaster, and this has been very evident in terms of the field research. And it makes more sense, as the saying goes in Trinidad and Tobago, that prevention is better and sometimes cheaper than cure. It makes sense to put in place sensible and cost-effective risk reduction programs to fight future catastrophes. The poor suffer the most in times of a disaster for simple reasons, and these are some stylized facts there. The poor have less resilience, they have fewer safety nets, which means that in times of a disaster or the times of a natural hazard, when that natural hazard impacts on that socioeconomic vulnerability of the poor, it manifests itself as a disaster. Women and children are at greater risk to disasters than men, particularly in developing countries. And some data suggests that between 1975 and 2000, 94% of the persons killed by disasters were from low-income or lower-middle-income families, and the poorest people comprised 68% of deaths from disasters. Again, the second main bullet point there suggests that in 1995, the UNDP estimated that 1.3 billion people were living in poverty, and then when you fast forward those numbers in terms of the global financial crisis that we've been having and the number of persons who are becoming unemployed, I don't think it is too difficult just to imagine that those figures would have adjusted upwards as time went on. Why the link between poverty, disasters, and microfinance institutions? MFIs tend to target their core clientele are the poor, so that when a disaster hits, when anything affects the capacity of their clientele to repay, it ultimately manifests itself in high rates of delinquency, and also the portfolio of the MFIs is threatened. As I say in the second sub-bullet point there, the portfolio quality and liquidity of the microfinance institution are put under stress when either natural or man-made, and I've included the man-made to account for things like the Dudos factor, for example, because in Jamaica that had a pretty significant negative impact on an MFI that was servicing that particular geographic area. In fact, it had become so serious that one or two of the clients, their loan had to be written off because they were no longer around to service their loans. They were, as it would be called, I think, collateral damage. They were collateral damage in that whole man-made kind of disaster. Disasters also affect microfinance institutions in terms of their human, physical, and financial capacity. Staff become a little jaded because they themselves have to see about their families. There might be physical damage to the building, etc. Service might be interrupted, basic services in terms of things like transportation, electricity, which then disrupts the normal business cycle of the MFI. Just some quick data to show data available from the Caribbean Development Bank based on their poverty assessment studies to show the percentage of persons by country living below the poverty line. And while some of these data are a little dated because of the lack of frequency of conducting the poverty assessment studies, I think certainly the trajectory in some of the countries suggests that anything that affects this vulnerable group of persons could ultimately have a serious impact on the MFI and by extension on the economy. So if you look at Belize in 2002 with 34% more or less living below the poverty line, Antigua and Barbuda 18%, in Dominica 39% at 2002,